They left for the all-inclusive resort without me 3 suites, 11 family members, and my card on file for incidentals. When I asked why, my mom said, "You're no fun on vacations." I just replied, "Enjoy the bar tab." Then I froze the account, flagged the card, and contacted the resort directly. At 2:03 p.m., I got a message from my dad. "They kicked us out. Are you kidding me?" 2 weeks earlier, Mom had asked me for temporary access to one of my cards because there was a family emergency. Grandma had recently needed medical attention, so I assumed it involved her. I gave Mom the information without pressing for details. That trust was apparently all they needed. The truth appeared on my cousin's social media story. My parents beside the pool, Emily and her husband drinking cocktails, my aunt and uncle with their 3 children, Grandma smiling beneath a sun hat. 11 people arranged together like a family portrait with one person deliberately cropped out. Me. I watched every post twice before opening my banking app. Travel agency. Flights. Resort deposit. Additional authorization holds. Charge after charge, all connected to an account carrying my name. The money was significant, but strangely, that wasn't what made my hands shake. It was the planning. They had chosen dates, booked rooms, coordinated flights, packed luggage, arranged transportation, and boarded a plane while every one of them understood that I had been excluded. Someone had entered my card information. Someone had approved the itinerary, and apparently nobody had thought. Maybe Andrea deserves to know. After Mom gave me her explanation, I called my bank. I froze the card and disputed every transaction I hadn't authorized. Then I contacted the resort directly, explained that the reservation had been funded through unauthorized use of my account, provided identification, and answered their questions. After that, I went back to work. At 2:03 that afternoon, Dad texted me. "They're making us leave. What did you do?" That sentence told me everything. Not what happened. Not did Mom misunderstand your permission. What did you do as though I were the person who had created the problem? Within an hour, my phone became almost unusable. Emily accused me of humiliating our parents. My uncle called me vindictive. Someone informed me that Grandma had cried. An aunt sent 3 paragraphs about forgiveness before accidentally revealing she had known about the trip for weeks. I answered none of them. They wanted a courtroom where they were simultaneously judge, jury, and victim. I wasn't volunteering to be the defendant. They returned home the following afternoon. The next morning, Mom ordered me to come to the house for a family discussion. When I ignored that message, she sent another telling me to behave like an adult. Dad followed with something less subtle. If I refused to show up, I shouldn't consider myself part of the family anymore. I read it twice and almost smiled. They had already taken a vacation designed around my absence, yet now they were threatening me with exclusion. That evening, they came to my apartment building. 6 buzzer calls, repeated knocks, phone calls every few minutes. My neighbor messaged me asking whether she should contact security or police. Eventually, my parents left, but the silence afterward felt temporary. 2 days later, I learned exactly how temporary. Human Resources contacted me regarding an anonymous complaint accusing me of unethical conduct. There were no useful details, only broad claims questioning my integrity. The timing was impossible to ignore. HR handled it professionally, reviewed my employment history, spoke with people who worked with me, and closed the matter quickly. Nothing came of it. But sitting alone that evening, I realized the frightening part wasn't whether the complaint succeeded. It was that someone close to me had apparently been willing to threaten my livelihood because I stopped allowing them to spend my money. That changed the way I approached everything. I stopped asking why my family was behaving this way and started asking what else they had done. I downloaded 12 months of statements and reviewed every transaction. 6 charges stood out. A hotel stay I had never booked, a rental car I had never driven, several online purchases shipped to my parents' address. Then I checked my credit report. A retail credit account had been opened under my name shortly after the resort disaster, and almost $3,000 in electronics had already been charged to it. I sat perfectly still for several seconds, staring at the screen. There are moments when anger burns so hot that it becomes strangely quiet. That was one of them. I filed an identity theft report and contacted the police. I supplied screenshots, account statements, dates, addresses, and the disputed vacation transactions. Then I froze my credit with every major bureau. Afterward, I wrote one public post explaining why my family had returned early from their vacation. I avoided dramatic language. I simply stated that a trip had been booked without my knowledge using my account, that additional unauthorized accounts had since appeared, and that the situation had been reported to law enforcement. The responses surprised me. 2 distant relatives privately told me they had experienced similar financial pressure from members of my family. One said a relative had tried to convince her to borrow money for a supposed business opportunity when she was 19. When she refused, everyone suddenly stopped speaking to her. That was when the pattern became impossible to unsee. The guilt, the money, the punishment. Whenever someone resisted, I had spent years believing each incident was separate, because admitting they were connected would have meant admitting something much uglier about the people who raised me. 2 nights later, I came home and found a handwritten envelope pushed beneath my door. Mom's handwriting covered 4 pages. It began with disappointment and lectures about loyalty. Then came accusations about embarrassing the family, upsetting Grandma, and betraying the people who had given me everything. By the final page, the tone had changed. She wrote that I needed to fix what I had done before the consequences became permanent. The last sentence was the only one I reread. If you want to keep the life you've built, think very carefully about what you do next. I folded the pages, placed them inside a clear plastic sleeve, and added them to the growing folder on my desk. For the first time, I wasn't reading my mother's words as guilt. I was reading them as evidence. The moment I started treating my mother's letter as evidence instead of emotional manipulation, everything changed. I called Rachel the next morning. She was an attorney I'd known since college, the kind of person who could listen to 10 minutes of chaos without interrupting and then reduce it to 3 clean questions. I sent her copies of the letter, the credit reports, the disputed transactions, and the HR complaint. She called me back less than an hour later. Andrea, stop responding to them completely, unless it's necessary. Save every message, screenshot everything. Write down dates, times, witnesses. If someone comes to your home or workplace, document it. Hearing her say it so calmly made the situation feel different, less like a family argument, more like something with consequences. I bought a binder that afternoon and started organizing my life by tabs: bank, credit, work, messages, police, family. Then I sent one email to the extended family. No insults, no accusations I couldn't prove. I simply explained what had happened in chronological order: the unauthorized vacation charges, the resort dispute, the attempt to damage my job, the new account opened under my identity, and the police report that followed. I included dates and reference numbers. At the end I wrote, "You're free to believe whatever version you want, but legal proceedings have begun, and I will not protect anyone from the consequences of their own actions." The response was immediate. Some relatives disappeared entirely, others suddenly wanted to hear both sides. Aunt Jenna surprised me by calling and saying she had suspected for years that Mom blurred the line between family money and other people's money. Apparently, I wasn't the first person who had been pressured, borrowed from, or punished for saying no. 3 days later, the detective assigned to my report called. He said they had begun reviewing the documents and had attempted to contact my parents. They hadn't agreed to an interview yet. I thanked him, wrote down the time of the call, and added another page to the binder. It was almost absurd how normal my days looked from the outside. I still went to work. I still answered emails and sat through meetings. I still stopped for groceries on the way home. But underneath all of it was the knowledge that the people who raised me were now subjects in an identity theft investigation because they couldn't accept the word no. The next escalation happened at my office. Reception called while I was finishing a report and told me my parents were downstairs demanding to see me. Mom had apparently told the receptionist this was an emergency and that I was emotionally unstable. Dad refused to leave until somebody threatened to call building security. I never went downstairs. I told reception that they were not authorized visitors and asked security to escort them out if necessary. That evening, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. It belonged to a shared account with both my parents' names attached. The message contained only a few lines. "What you're doing is destroying this family. If you continue, we will make sure you lose everything you care about. You will not get away with this." I forwarded it to Rachel before I even finished reading it twice. Her response came quickly. "Send this to the detective." She explained that depending on the circumstances, a direct threat tied to an active investigation could create additional problems for them. So I forwarded it. No dramatic response to Mom. No warning to Dad. I didn't need them to understand what they had done. I needed a record showing that they had done it. That night, strangely, I slept better than I had since the resort incident. Their message was supposed to frighten me, but instead it confirmed something I had been resisting. There was no reconciliation waiting around the corner. I didn't need to keep wondering whether I was overreacting. The next morning brought another surprise. My landlord emailed me asking whether I had authorized someone to enter my apartment the day before. According to him, a caller had claimed to be me and said a relative needed access to retrieve medication and personal documents while I was at work. My landlord knew my voice and became suspicious when the caller avoided basic questions about the lease, so he refused. I read the email twice, then called him directly. By that afternoon, I had arranged for the locks to be changed. I installed a door camera and asked management not to release information about me to anyone without written verification. I hated doing it. Not because it was expensive, but because every new precaution was another acknowledgement that my parents no longer respected even the physical boundaries of my home. That incident pushed me into taking the civil side seriously. Rachel helped me find an attorney who handled financial fraud and harassment cases, and we began preparing a complaint. The claims covered unauthorized financial activity, damages connected to the fraudulent accounts, harassment, and costs I had incurred protecting myself. I didn't announce anything online. I didn't threaten them with it. Papers were filed, dates were set, and several days later, my parents were formally served at their house. Emily somehow learned about it almost immediately. She sent me a voice message nearly 4 minutes long. I never listened. I downloaded the file, saved it under the date, and placed it with everything else. My relationship with my family had become so distorted that a voicemail from my own sister was no longer communication. It was potential evidence. Their social media campaign started soon afterward. Mom posted vague messages about children forgetting everything their parents sacrificed for them. Dad shared quotes about betrayal. Emily uploaded a photograph of Mom crying and wrote about the pain of watching your own daughter try to destroy the people who raised her. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I contacted the resort. The manager remembered the group immediately. He confirmed that the reservation had become a problem after the disputed payment and that several members of the family had caused a scene when staff required them to resolve the billing issue or leave. When I asked whether he could provide a written account for my attorney, he agreed. That document mattered more to me than 100 angry Facebook posts. The detective called again later that week. My parents had finally spoken with investigators, and according to him, their explanation centered around family permission and a supposed misunderstanding about what they were allowed to charge. The problem was that the story didn't line up neatly with the account records or the credit application opened afterward. I could hear his careful, professional tone, but even without details, I understood that things were no longer going the way my parents expected. For years, their greatest weapon had been the ability to redefine what happened. A demand became a favor. Pressure became concern. Taking became borrowing. Once everything was written down with dates and account numbers, those tricks stopped working. Then, they used Grandma. Emily sent me a photograph of her lying in a hospital bed with the message, She doesn't have much time. If you let her die thinking you hate this family, you'll regret it forever. For a moment, every defense I had built collapsed. I stared at Grandma's face and almost grabbed my keys. Then something about the photo bothered me. Her hair was longer than it had been recently. I called the hospital directly. Grandma was not admitted. After several calls, I learned she had only attended a routine appointment the previous day and had gone home afterward. The photograph was old. They had taken an image from another medical visit and weaponized it because they knew Grandma was the one person I might still respond to. That was the final time I contacted them directly. I sent one message: "Do not contact me again, except through legal counsel. Any further attempts to access my home, workplace, finances, or accounts will be documented." Then I blocked every number and account I could identify. The silence that followed lasted for several weeks. I began waking up without checking my phone immediately. I cooked dinner again. I went to the gym without wondering whether my parents would be standing in my hallway when I returned. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was the closest thing I had felt in months. Then an unknown number called. I ignored it. A voicemail appeared moments later from my cousin Mark. His voice was hesitant. He said he wasn't calling to defend anyone, but there was something I needed to know. I called him back from work the next day. He told me my parents and Rob had been talking to a local journalist who occasionally wrote human interest stories. They were preparing their own version of the vacation disaster. In theirs, I had supposedly offered to pay for everyone and then withdrawn the money while they were already traveling because I was angry about some unrelated family disagreement. Mark said they had screenshots that looked like text conversations between me and Mom. He believed some of them were fake. They were also describing me as unstable and vindictive, hoping to turn the lawsuit into proof that I had always been the problem. I called Rachel immediately. She didn't sound surprised. By the end of the day, we were preparing cease and desist letters warning my parents and Rob against publishing false factual claims or fabricated communications. But before completely cutting myself away from everyone connected to them, there was one person I still wanted to see. I drove to Grandma's house the following weekend. She was sitting on the porch beneath a light blanket despite the warm weather, watching birds attack the feeder beside her garden. She looked at me when I walked up, but she didn't ask about lawsuits or police reports. Neither did I. We talked about tomatoes, her neighbor's ridiculous cat, and a church fundraiser she thought was badly organized. For an hour, I remembered what family was supposed to feel like when nobody wanted anything from you. As I stood to leave, Grandma reached for my hand. Her fingers were smaller than I remembered. "Andrea," she said softly, "I always knew you were the strong one." That was all. No request that I forgive anyone. No lecture about blood. No demand that I come home and make peace. I squeezed her hand and walked back to my car. Sitting behind the wheel, I finally understood why her words hurt more than all the threats. Strength had never been staying and tolerating everything. Maybe strength was knowing when there was nothing left to save. The weeks after I visited Grandma were strangely uneventful. Rachel sent the cease and desist letters, my attorney continued handling the civil case, and whatever article my parents had been trying to manufacture never appeared. Mark told me later that the journalist backed away once questions were raised about the authenticity of the screenshots. After that, I blocked Mark too. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because I finally understood that every open line back into the family eventually became another way for their chaos to reach me. The lawsuit moved into settlement discussions. My parents offered to reimburse the fraudulent charges, cover part of my legal fees, and sign an agreement promising no further contact. There was one condition. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and agree not to discuss what happened publicly. When my attorney read the proposal to me, I almost laughed. Months earlier, I might have accepted just to make everything disappear. Now I understood what they actually wanted. They didn't want peace. They wanted silence. I told my attorney no. By then, getting the money back wasn't the point. I could recover financially. What I couldn't accept was helping them rewrite the story into another convenient family misunderstanding. If I signed away my right to speak, they could spend the rest of their lives telling relatives that Andrea had thrown a tantrum over a vacation and then taken a settlement because she knew she was wrong. I wanted the legal record to remain exactly what it was: disputed charges, identity theft allegations, harassment, documented threats, and a lawsuit that existed because they had crossed boundaries again and again. Rachel asked if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything. For once, I wasn't making a decision based on whether Mom would cry, whether Dad would rage, whether Emily would call me selfish, or whether Grandma would be disappointed. I was making it because it was right for me. 4 months after the resort trip, the noise finally began to die. The social media posts stopped. The vague quotes disappeared. Nobody came to my apartment. Nobody called my office. Even my phone seemed quieter. I began rebuilding routines that had nothing to do with evidence folders or police reports. Then one evening I opened my mailbox and found a plain white envelope with no return address. I recognized Dad's handwriting immediately. Inside was a check made out to me for the exact amount charged for the resort portion of the vacation. Not the fraudulent store account. Not the other transactions. Just the resort. A small note was folded behind it. This should cover everything. I assume this ends here. No apology. No acknowledgement that they had excluded me while spending my money. No mention of the HR complaint, the threats, the attempt to access my apartment, or Grandma's fake hospital emergency. Just a number and an expectation that money could purchase an ending. I sat at my kitchen table with that check in front of me for almost an hour. Years earlier, Dad had taught me that debts mattered more than apologies. If he repaid $20 after insulting someone, he considered the matter closed. Looking at his handwriting, I realized he still thought exactly the same way. In his mind, returning the resort money transformed theft into borrowing. Once the balance became zero, I was supposed to become his daughter again and stop causing trouble. So I made a photocopy of the check, put the original in another envelope, attached a copy of the police report, and mailed everything back. I wrote no note. There was nothing left to explain. If a police report stapled to his repayment didn't communicate the difference between a debt and a crime, another paragraph from me certainly wouldn't. I expected sending it back to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt sad in a distant way. Not because I wanted my parents back, but because the check confirmed they had learned almost nothing. I had spent months secretly hoping that consequences might force some moment of clarity. Maybe Mom would finally say, "We shouldn't have done it." Maybe Dad would admit they had treated me like an account instead of a daughter. That fantasy disappeared with one sentence. I assume this ends here. They weren't sorry they had hurt me. They were frustrated that hurting me had become expensive. Once I admitted that to myself, something inside me finally stopped waiting. I turned my attention toward the vulnerabilities they had exposed. I met with a financial advisor and separated everything that could possibly be connected to old family information. New bank accounts, new passwords, new security questions, alerts for purchases, credit inquiries, address changes, and login attempts. I kept my credit frozen unless I personally needed it opened. I purchased legal protection through work and made sure my landlord had updated emergency contact instructions. At first, all those precautions felt like evidence that my family had permanently damaged me. Eventually, they felt like something else: ownership. My money was mine. My home was mine. My identity was mine. None of those statements should have felt revolutionary. But after growing up in a house where family often meant everyone was entitled to whatever you had, they did. I also started therapy. Not because I was collapsing, I was actually functioning better than I had in years, but because one question kept bothering me. Why had it taken something this extreme for me to say no? My therapist never gave me some dramatic diagnosis or easy answer. We talked about smaller memories instead. Mom borrowing things without asking and making me feel selfish when I wanted them returned. Dad expecting me to contribute money because I was the responsible one. Emily being forgiven for things I would have been punished for. Vacations where I handled reservations. Emergencies where my card came out first. Every incident alone seemed insignificant. Together, they formed the blueprint of the role I had been assigned. I wasn't valued because I was Andrea. I was valued because I was reliable, useful, and easy to guilt. That realization changed the way I thought about relationships outside my family, too. A few months later, friends convinced me to attend a trivia night at a neighborhood bar. That was where I met Mason. He was sitting across from me on another team, arguing confidently that an answer about a 1990s movie was correct when it absolutely wasn't. Afterward, he came over to admit defeat and bought me a drink as payment for being obnoxiously certain. We started talking, then exchanged numbers. There was nothing dramatic about it. No instant destiny. Just coffee, another trivia night, dinner, and eventually weekends together. The strange thing was how little effort being around him required. If I said I was tired, he didn't accuse me of rejecting him. If I wanted to pay for something, he didn't expect it. If I said no, the conversation simply continued. I didn't tell Mason the entire story immediately. The first time he asked about my family, I only said, "We're not close anymore. It's complicated." I braced myself for questions. Instead, he nodded and said, "Okay, you can tell me whatever you want when you want." That sentence stayed with me because it contained something my parents had almost never given me: permission to have boundaries without defending them. Eventually, I told him more: the resort, the credit accounts, the lawsuit. He didn't turn it into entertainment or tell me what I should have done. He just looked at me for a moment and said, "That must have been exhausting." Somehow those 5 words made me feel more understood than 4 pages of family accusations ever had. Around that time, I had a dream about my childhood home. I was sitting at the old kitchen table while Mom cooked dinner with the radio playing. Dad was somewhere in the living room. Emily walked past carrying a glass of water. Nothing frightening happened. Nobody argued. It looked exactly like hundreds of ordinary evenings from my childhood. But in the dream, nobody could see me. I watched Mom move around the kitchen and realized I was sitting inside a memory that no longer belonged to the person I had become. When I woke up, I expected to cry. I didn't. I wasn't angry either. I simply understood that missing the version of my family I wished existed was not the same thing as wanting the real one back. The civil case eventually moved forward without the dramatic courtroom explosion Emily probably imagined. Attorneys exchanged documents. Financial records were reviewed. Agreements were negotiated. I stopped obsessively checking every development. My lawyer handled what needed handling, and I lived my life. The investigation remained separate, and I let the people responsible for it decide where it went. For months, I had measured success by what consequences my parents might face. Eventually, I stopped. Whether they lost money, reputation, relationships, or nothing at all no longer determined whether I had won. The important thing had already happened. They had lost access to me. Sometimes I still wondered whether Mom would appear at my door one day, whether Dad would send another check, whether Emily would create a new account just to tell me how cruel I was. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But the possibility no longer controlled the temperature of my day. My accounts were protected. My home was secure. My employer knew the situation. My attorney had the records. More importantly, I no longer needed their approval to believe my own version of what happened. They had left me behind on purpose, used my money as if it belonged to them, and expected me to stay silent because that was the role I had always played. When I finally stopped playing it, they called me cruel. I used to think the story ended the afternoon. I froze that card and got 11 angry people removed from a resort. For a while, I even enjoyed imagining that as the perfect revenge. My family standing in a hotel lobby surrounded by luggage while their free vacation disappeared. But that wasn't the ending. Revenge would have meant I was still organizing my life around making them suffer. The real ending was much quieter. It was waking up beside a man who respected the word no. It was checking my phone without fear. It was spending my own money without wondering who else considered themselves entitled to it. It was realizing that when my parents erased me from their vacation, they accidentally showed me exactly what my place in their family had always been. So I stopped fighting for that place. They wanted a family without me. Eventually, I gave them exactly that. And for the first time in my life, walking away didn't feel like losing anything. It felt like finally moving forward.